I'll start off by welcoming you to the festival and asking you, you had a great premiere last night. A lot of people had questions afterwards. Talk a bit about how this project sort of came to fruition and how you got it put together.
Sure. I first read it as a writing sample of Michael's, and I was really taken by his writing, but didn't really see myself in the script or why I would want to pursue it. And then I revisited the script, and after a certain period of my life, and realized that there were some themes in there that I was very interested in exploring, and aspects of myself, and how much was a Westinghouse, how much was I Edison, and the idea of obviously these. It started with Edison, really, of a person who's trying to and succeeds in doing the impossible and trapping the beast and settling the erratic, and doing that with an image, with sound, with light, and then in discovering George Westinghouse, who I knew nothing about, really, very little about, and seeing the humility in him, and seeing and watching as both men kind of became very similar to each other, kind of cross paths, and one goes a little dark and one kind of loses his way, but both start as if you think about it, I think the air brakes and the phonograph were being developed concurrently, and so they're self-made men, creative men, genius men, and I started to be the more I read about it, the more I talked to Michael about it, the more interested I was in a person like Edison, who comes from a world of almost spontaneous invention, without really seeing the purpose for it first, and that he kind of creates the purpose for something, as opposed to someone like Westinghouse, who kind of sees how it could. It seems like his instinct was he can immediately see how it contextualizes something and how it could be greater for society, as opposed to Edison, who does that and creates the need for it as well. Anyway, so that was obviously fascinating as creative types, and as inventors, they. And artists, perhaps, with a small a, and certainly when speaking of myself, but inventors are looking for solutions, and solutions are permanent. So there was something about the permanence and legacy, and it just kept going deeper, and the movie started kind of revealing more and more layers to it. Certainly the rivalry between them was interesting, but overall, what did it say about me and the world, and how we could, through invention and technology, be conscious of leaving it a better place than we found it.
Maybe, Michael, you can chime in on this. How did this project come about? This is fresh out of your mind, wasn't it? It wasn't based on any other thing?
No, I did the primary research. I mean, it's based on history, yeah, of course. But about 10 years ago, I started it as a play, and I just couldn't believe that there was this cutthroat race between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, who is from, or spent most of his time in my hometown of Pittsburgh, racing to light up the world, which resulted in Edison's secret development of the electric chair to smear the competition. I mean, when I read that, I couldn't believe that I had never heard of it, and just that I'd never seen it dramatized before. And from that moment, I was completely hooked, not just into the plot events, but about the themes, some of the themes of the movie, of truth versus popularity, especially in America.
And Benedict, how much did you know about Thomas Edison's history and his life story before you came to this project?
Very little. I discovered it as I went along. I really was in the dark, not to pun a phrase, but he, I guess, existed as this sort of companion to his invention. I thought his invention of the light bulb, not his development of someone else's. And that goes for a lot of what he achieved in his life. It was a furthering or a progression of other ideas, as well as his own unique and original ideas that marked him out. And I was really drawn to the flaw of someone who began life in a very humble way, traversed great difficulty, but used it to his benefit. His severe his bad hearing. And then the story itself seemed to me more about someone who really chose not to hear a repeated truth, something that he couldn't really afford to acknowledge because of how far down the road he was and how that corrupted him. And the more research I did, that Michael lent me, that books I read like Empires of Light and various biographies of Edison, the more I realized there's a very varied reception, a very varied understanding and appreciation of the man. So in a way that gave us a freedom to tell our story the way it is. But yeah, the short answer to your question is I knew very little at the beginning.
And Michael, there was not a lot of information about George Westinghouse because he destroyed all the documents about his life just before he died. You were talking about this last night at the screening. How difficult was it for you to put together this character in your mind and then to portray him?
It wasn't super difficult because my goal wasn't to try and create an exact total replication of George Westinghouse. It's just not possible. So it was more, I just more considered his point of view and his way of being in the world, his way of dealing with people. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, inhabiting this ghost of what I suppose this person might have been kind of like, But it's a ghost. There's nobody's going to come along and say, "Oh, you messed that up," because nobody knows.
And what about you, Nicholas? And Nikola Tesla, the name Tesla is well known now, but not so well known not that long ago. How much of his history did you know, or what fascinated you about him?
I didn't know much at all going into it. I knew the name and the rough outlines of a few things he created, but yeah, going into it and learning all his idiosyncratic nature and his obsessive compulsive moments in his life, and also his germophobia, all these little elements, his imagination, and all these things that kind of built him up to be slightly odd perhaps, but also incredible in terms of what he could create. That was just amazing to read about, and then learn about the foresight that he had, and how selfless he was in many ways in terms of the work really being for the good ultimately.
All right, we'll open it up to questions. We've got Bruce down here.
Good afternoon. Bruce Kirkland from the Toronto Sun and Postmedia News Network. I'd like to loop back to something Benedict referred to, and that's the conflicted historical records on Thomas Edison, because it would be easy to argue, based on some evidence, that he was like a robber baron and a crook, and he stole other people's inventions, and the way he ran his patents was an abuse of power. Yet by playing him, you make him sympathetic by the nature of how film works. It's a really interesting conundrum. So my question really relates to how much an actor judges the character that he's playing based on his own research, and then frees himself to do the character as written in the script.
It's a very good question. I think it's deadly to judge your character if you're portraying someone. You have to inhabit it with a certain amount of understanding or empathy or sympathy, whatever you want to call it. And to fulfill that, it's not about coming down on sides. It's not about journalistic headlines or black and white truth versus fiction or good against evil. It's much more complex than that. And I think what we see is a man who had achieved a great deal from humble beginnings, who feels assailed in the world. I don't think that ever left him. I don't know where it began, that need to succeed, to win, to have a control. But it's an ugly truth, and yet it's formed out of something that's very human. I think there's some degree of salvation in the sense that he admits he was wrong. He knows he was wrong, and he doesn't view it as being robbed. But he did then go on to, as you say, overlord a lot of patent controls over certain inventions that he had a lot to do with. But he wanted to keep that fence very high and very strong, and keep those people out of his inventive garden, so to speak. Rather than, as George Westinghouse proposes, why not just do it together and have a bigger garden? And I think that's of course, I think that's the greater way, but who knows? We weren't there. And I think as far as what you have to do in the passage of time that we have to tell this story in, and the immediate history that we're trying to characterize, to me it was very understandable to be, I'm not in a personal association with this, although it was very interesting examining ideas of fame and how that can poison integrity, about how you can lose the ideal in the machinations of jealousy and other emotions, which are very, very human, despite your best instincts not to. Those seem to me very human flaws, and I still have a great deal of sympathy for him, even if he didn't go about it the right way. You can see how he made those wrong turns, if they are wrong. I find it very, very, I leave it to other people to judge characters I play. I find it very hard not to be defensive for the very reasons you say. I think I'm not trying to polish something. I'm not trying to make something nicer than it should be. I'm not afraid of, I have no vanity about my characters. I don't think that you need to do a good publicity spin on them. I don't think that, I hope that's not what it is. But to examine it fully, you can't help but have some love for those people, however wrong their actions may turn out to be.
This love for these historical characters, you've done a number of period pieces. You played Alan Turing a couple of years ago. Are you drawn more and more to real characters rather than fictional ones?
No. I think, like I said, I didn't know much about Edison. It wasn't really that was the draw. The draw was the script and the human dilemma I saw in it, not the idea of playing a sort of totemic cultural figure. And that's kind of, if you do that, and in a way, it's terrifying. Like Michael says, there's in some cases these are ghosts. You're playing with the idea of something rather than being it, even though you are being it yourself, but you're not being the thing it was, if that makes any sense. You're approximating, you're interpreting, you're trying to channel something of it as a storyteller, and that's what attracts you rather than the challenge. Because in a way, if you have the expectations that people who are real have a more detailed or very strong stance on a character, then you can really come unstuck, I think. Well, and that happens in fiction as well. I played some much loved fictional characters, whether in the comic world or Sherlock or whatever, and you're treading on hallowed ground for a lot of fans that were there way before you started meddling with that material. So you can't be inhibited with that. You respect it, but you have to bring yourself to the work rather than everybody else's preconceived idea of what it should be.
We have a question over here and one over there.
Mila Kanev, Mix TV. The question for the actors, it's such interesting emotional roles. I'm just wondering, from where did you get your inspirations, how to do it really exactly this particular, just about your creative process, I would like to know.
Well, something that inspired me was that Alfonso found a book about George Westinghouse. It's a very beautiful little leather-bound, very old book. And it's very hard to find a book about George Westinghouse. And it was almost like a tribute to George Westinghouse. It was written by somebody who had a great deal of respect for him and talked about what a great man he was and all of his accomplishments. And yeah, by the time I finished reading it, it really done a number on me. So that's kind of was the foundation of my work on the film. You know.
I had a similar very thin volume, which was an extract of a diary late from Edison's life, and I think it's out of print. And Alfonso and the production found a copy, and I mean, partly going back to that question, it just illuminated a very human core to this man. He talked very frankly about his dreams. He was very funny. He was very self-deprecating. He talked a lot about his diet and bowel movements or lack thereof. He talked about his love, his fantasy world. He talked about his great love of literature, what he was buying. He talked about how he got into a mess in New York because he asked the conductor on a tram which stop he should get off at, and he couldn't hear him. And it's little keys to that make you go, in our story, we're very much trying to look beyond the P.T. Barnum presentational Edison, although there are a couple of moments of that, and closer at the private man and what the machinations of that were, and the failures in that as well, with the neglect of his family that his obsession kind of brought about. But I was very warmed by that. I thought that Michael had done an incredible job of being true to that little nugget of light, to a true source of who he was like with his imagination. I'm sure you'd read that as well. The diary extracts, but so yeah, that was an inspiration.
For Tesla, through this story, he'd had the vision or idea in his brain when he was about 6 years old, I think, of harnessing the power of waterfalls and creating electricity through that. So that was, his main goal, particularly through this part of the story that we see him at. And then the interesting thing that Alfonso did for me was turn me on to listening to Glenn Gould's Bach variations, because you get little snippets of Tesla in this movie, but he has such highs and lows because he sees so far into the future that a lot of people can't comprehend what he's trying to express. And obviously that makes you feel very misunderstood, and also he ends up penniless and then comes back, and he's so many ups and downs that listening to someone play those songs, those compositions at varying different times in their life and trying to tap into whatever that was going on with him was kind of useful in a way for Tesla.
We have some question in the back.
Yes, Victor Brains, Marshall Radio Regent. I have a question for either Michael or Alfonso. The character of McCoy, who actually they coined the phrase "the real McCoy," he was a very prolific inventor. He actually worked for Edison, and also I wanted to know the sequence in the film where Westinghouse was a soldier in the Union Army. Did that incident really happen where he tricked the guy into holding the gun up so the powder would get wet?
I'll answer one of them. Elijah McCoy. Yeah, it was just in casting the film and looking at the overall pictures and groups. It's how diverse could it be and still be real? Not just force something, but what was the world at the time? What was even specifically Pittsburgh at the time? And in the research, Elijah McCoy was a Canadian and had done some work, I think, with lubrication of brakes or something like that. So he knew Edison, had worked with Westinghouse, and why not invite him to a party at the Westinghouses? And so that was an important touch. If I could do anything, and it still felt historically accurate, that was responsibility. At some point, it was important to me to add that as much as I possibly could to the film. And Michael, you could talk about the Civil War flashbacks.
George Westinghouse did indeed fight in the Civil War, first in the Army, and then really made his mark in the Navy. But while he was in the Army, and his brother died in the actual gun moment where he outsmarts the other soldier is an invention of what I thought could have happened that day. There's scant information on sort of what was going on. But an interesting detail is that on the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, Westinghouse, who felt so devoted to everyone that he fought alongside, he hosted a free dinner, brought everyone in, hundreds and hundreds of every living soldier to Pittsburgh and to his factories to honor them.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Good evening. Good afternoon. I just saw this movie this morning. It was a great story and a great performance from everybody here. My question was asked, but I'm going to ask a new question. How do you, three of the men leader in this a film, how do you enjoy work each other? Is any interesting story happen on the site?
For Benedict and I, well, because we only really have the one scene together at the end. I was really looking forward to shooting that scene. The filming started primarily with Edison's stuff because I was doing, I wasn't even available yet or something. And so they shot a lot of Benedict stuff first, and then I showed up. Yeah, and he was having a baby. It was crazy, heady days. So we kind of blocked it out, and then towards the end of shooting my stuff, Benedict came back, and we shot that scene in Brighton, the Brighton, what's it called? The Pavilion. And the beautiful. I remember walking in a room and seeing that set and just feeling, this has got to be one of the coolest sets I've ever been on in a movie. And I felt that way so many times when we were shooting in the house that was Westinghouse's home. It was just really exciting, inspiring, these locations, you know. And it was weird to be working with Nick playing Tesla because we had done another film together where he killed me. So this was a lot friendlier, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that was because originally in the script that was kind of the one scene for Tesla was with George Westinghouse in the hotel room, and I read that and loved the scene, but also knew it was Michael playing the role, and I was just like, I loved working with him previously, so I was like, brilliant. I'll sign up to do that and hang with him again.
I was very excited when I heard about these two being cast. I was over the moon. I think this one here is one of our era's great heavyweights. He's the real deal, and he does what cinema can do best. He's just got it all, and theatre as well. But I've only seen him on screen, sadly. But and this young pup. We'd met a couple of times, haven't we? Oh yeah, but we'd not. What does that mean? Tongues will mag. Yeah, no, but I was very excited to work with Nick as well, and we had fun, and I got the giggles very quickly because he's very funny, and I loved my scene with Michael. It really upped my game, and I'd had a bit of a break, and it's such an important moment to have those two men have a almost consolatory meeting, isn't it? In a way, it ends with the big question: why not just share the rewards? Why not just enjoy it and move on together? And I like to think in that moment anyway, the thought process from my character, you'll have to sort of see what you think of it, but I like to think that he's like, I accept I maybe got that wrong, but he moves on to new terrain, and a new tyranny of that terrain. But in that brief moment, I think he has a point, maybe, but I don't know. He has just sort of talks about how a fence is a steal because only one man makes it and the other man benefits. But he has the stronger point in that argument, which is that you don't need the fence; you can just share. Anyway, I had a great time working with these two.
Okay, that about takes care of our time. The Current War is a TIFF special presentation. It will actually hit select theaters across Canada and the U.S. starting November 24th. Thank you all for being here. Thank you guys for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey You Guys!